In this chapter, we look at some of the environmental factors that are driving the wildfire threat, that are creating new conditions for wildfires and exacerbating the hazard that they pose to our communities. So, what we're seeing as we've seen climate change, we've seen drought, we've seen increased temperatures across the West. We're seeing fires in areas that didn't have fires before. We're seeing more intense and hotter burning fires. We've seen just a different threat from wildfires than what we've experienced in the past. So it's important to take a few minutes and really dive into this issue of what's happening, how that's affecting wildfires. And that's going to set us up for later chapters where we actually talk about how to better respond given these changing conditions. So the American West right now has been experiencing drought since essentially about the year 2000. So almost 20 years of prolonged drought. In May 2021, about 61% of the region was considered to be in severe drought, and 21% was in what's called exceptional drought. And because this was considered late spring, it was very early and unusual to see that level of drought across the region. So this is an issue that's creating new challenges for communities in the area. California snowpack was at 59% of its long-term average this year, and that means typical snowmelt is going to be far lower, contributing to less water in area streams, rivers, less soil moisture, right? All of that contributes to the potential for wildfires over the course of the summer as things heat up and dry out even more. So as we see these drought conditions, the reason that becomes such a challenge is because it stresses trees. It stresses plants, so it dries them out, makes them more vulnerable to ignition. It pulls moisture out of the soil, which contributes to lower humidity overall, and higher temperatures, which makes areas more vulnerable to fire as well. When you see that persistent drought and you see that drying soil, it also becomes less capable of absorbing rainfall. So think of how a sponge works. When a sponge is very dry, if you just drop it into water, it floats until it absorbs enough to actually become absorbent. So a sponge has to be a little bit damp to actually do its job of absorbing liquid. Soil's kind of the same way. If it's very, very dry, when rain falls, it'll actually just run off and not absorb into the soil. So as soil dries, it becomes more prone to erosion. It weakens the trees further when the soil gets eroded around from their roots. That makes them more vulnerable to fire and just creates those conditions where fires can very quickly and very easily get out of control. So what we're also seeing is climate change contributing to warmer temperatures across the West. So higher temperatures contribute to wildfire threats because more moisture falls as rain instead of snow. So snow kind of acts like a moisture battery, if you will. It stores it as snow until it melts, and then it can release into the environment in the spring. When it falls as rain, it's immediately lost because it either soaks into the groundwater or it flows into streams and goes away. It doesn't stay in the environment like it does if it falls as snow. So hotter summers also make thunderstorms more likely. So despite what Smokey the Bear tells you, most wildfires are caused by lightning. And so when we have conditions that create more thunderstorms, we're going to have more lightning events, which contributes to more wildfires. And as we see these higher temps, that continues to pull more moisture from the plants in the soil and makes fires more likely because the fuel is drier. So when a fire does begin, it can quickly grow out of control. Whereas if there is more moisture in the environment, in the plants in the soil, that fire may extinguish itself or just expand more slowly and be able to be fought more efficiently. Another issue with climate change is that we're seeing shorter and warmer winters. And the reason that becomes an issue is that lengthens the actual time of what we consider fire season, because fire season tends to be sort of summer, late summer when conditions are hotter and drier. But because winter is coming later, we have that longer warm period in the fall. And because it's warming up sooner in the spring, we're seeing that drying and rising temperatures happen earlier and earlier, creating more conditions for fire to exist. We're also seeing that these warmer, shorter winters are contributing to the survival of forest pests, things like bark beetles, which normally in a long, cold winter, many of them would die out. So when spring comes around, there's fewer remaining beetles to create issues, but because fewer are dying in the winter, that means there's more, and they're stressing trees, killing more trees. That creates more fuel for potential fires. There's lots of reasons why these warmer, shorter winters are creating problems for our forests because the pests are increasing, the vulnerability to fire increases, and because we're seeing that later snow, later cooler temperatures, that means fires that do begin can actually burn longer than they otherwise would, consuming more areas and causing more danger. So we've discussed snow patterns and persistent drought, but we also see more intense rainfall happening in some areas. And what happens is we're seeing more intense rainfall, but fewer overall events. So if you look at kind of the average rainfall for a year, you'll actually see that it stays relatively the same as it's been, but we're seeing that rain happen in fewer, more intense events than we otherwise would. So when that happens, we see more higher runoff, we see more erosion, but we also see longer periods of dry weather, and that's the conditions when fires can erupt, is when we have those length of dry spells between those rainstorms. So this also becomes an issue after a fire occurs, because when a fire burns through, clears out the vegetation, clears out the brush and the trees, that leaves areas more vulnerable to erosion. And so when we have these intense rain events that come after fires, we actually see an erosion of the soil, which makes them less capable of supporting regrowth after the fire event. So we're seeing less regrowth happening. The species that are moving in are often non-native or invasive species, and that's contributing to vulnerability going forward as well. And so, as I mentioned, the arrival of invasive species has also contributed to increasing vulnerability to wildfire. Many of these invasive species are actually more prone to burning. So when they do ignite, they tend to burn hotter, they tend to burn faster. And so they actually create conditions that make wildfires worse than what they would have been without those invasive species. They also crowd out the existing species that have adapted to the fire regime that exists in particular forests and changes the vulnerability as the species change. And these invasive species are introduced in a number of ways: overgrazing, release species, logging, other factors. That all brings invasive species into different environments and contributes to wildfire vulnerability. So to wrap up this chapter, the important thing to note is that conditions are changing, whether it's due to climate change, drought, invasive species. All of these factors are changing our forest environments, and that change is in the negative direction. We're seeing forests that are much more vulnerable to intense wildfires. The conditions that we've created through years of fire suppression, through invasive species, through drought, have all contributed to really tinderbox conditions across the West in the US and in other countries. We've seen fires in Australia as well. So it's important to note that these environmental conditions are changing, and we need to think differently about how we adapt to and respond to wildfires in the face of these changing conditions.